Ladies and gentlemen, if the Joint Committee on Energy and Manufacturing will come to order, the clerk will take a silent roll. It's my understanding we do not have a quorum, so we will deal with organizational motions the next time we meet. On the agenda today is a presentation from Asim Haq, who is the Vice President of State Policy and Member Services for the PJM Interconnection. And his topic, as you can see, will be energy transition at PJM, resource requirements, replacements, and risks. And he'll be addressing a report PJM issued on February 24th, 2023. I would like us as a committee to hear the presentation, and I would assume that he would be available to questions, so we'll hold the questions until the end of the presentation. At this point, Mr. Haq, if you're on, I'll turn the committee meeting over for your presentation. Mr. Haq, we cannot hear you.
Are you muted?
So Greg, we're going to count on you to give this briefing if you can. Somebody unmute that here.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Mr. Haq.
How we are viewing the energy transition and concerns around reliability during the energy transition. I really appreciate the opportunity to present virtually today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I actually had Achilles repair surgery on Friday of last week and unceremoniously announced my retirement from the sport of basketball. I tore it playing with much younger competitors. So I'm done with the sport of basketball. You're all invited to my retirement ceremony. I'll get you invites. That's a joke. I will not be holding a retirement ceremony for my pathetic basketball playing skills. But again, thank you for the opportunity to present. We're going to go to the first substantive slide, and please stop me at any point if you've got questions. This can be an open dialogue, and I'm happy to field questions as I progress through this presentation. I always like to begin presentations to state government and policymakers here. And so this is effectively representing, it's a visual representation about the basics of power delivery. And power delivery generally consists of three components. You've got the generation of a watt, and then you've got the transmission of that watt across high voltage transmission lines. Then that watt goes to a distribution substation where it is then taken by a distribution utility and provided to customers. And so where PJM functions in the industry is on the generation and transmission components, which are generally thought of as the bulk power system. The distribution level that's intrastate in nature and regulated by state PSCs unless they're municipals or co-ops. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then the necessity of an entity like us is because the bulk power system, the grid, is a machine, and three really big machines, in fact, in the United States. You've got the Eastern Interconnection, which is colored there in the lighter blue color. You have the Western Interconnection, and you've got Texas. Those are the three primary sort of grid machines in the country. And electrons, they don't know state boundaries. And the bulk transmission system is interstate in nature. And so entities like PJM, created by the federal government to oversee the transfer of those electrons that are interstate in nature. And so we plan and operate the bulk system for part of the Eastern Connection, not the entire Eastern Connection, but part of the Eastern Connection for 13 states and the District of Columbia, including the entirety of the state of West Virginia. Let's go to the next slide, please. PJM's been around for a while. It began as a power pool in 1927, and it has evolved from there. We're not going to go through the intricacies of this slide, but you'll see a body there listed a few times, and that is the FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and that is our regulator. We are technically a public utility under the law. But let's go to the next slide. We are pretty different from your typical utility company based upon the function that we serve in our setup. Here are some ways that we are different. One of the more important differences I'll point out is that we are effectively a nonprofit. Our rates are predetermined by the FERC. Our budget is predetermined. And at the end of the year, if we come in under our budget, we refund that money back to the PJM members and into the pockets of consumers. We don't have shareholders. We are not concerned about share prices. We are not concerned about quarterly earnings. We are effectively a nonprofit that is mission driven. We also don't own any of the actual infrastructure. We don't own those assets. We direct the traffic and plan for the construction of those assets at the regional level, but we don't own any of them. So everything we do is in partnership with our transmission owners and our generation owners to advance our mission when we're talking purely about the infrastructure of the grid. Okay, next slide, please. So what is that mission? And really, it has a few components, but primarily it is the preservation of reliability, system reliability. Our society, our regional and local economies have come to expect and rely upon us in the industry, maintaining a reliable system. And so each and every day, that's what we strive to do. And we support that primary focus through these components, markets, operations, and planning. And we'll just do a quick dive into those three. Next slide, please. So when you think about regional planning, think about it like the concept of urban planning. So if you're planning out the grid into the future, taking a forward look at the grid, knowing where demand exists, knowing where supply is or wants to go, how do you construct the transmission system in order to ensure that watts can be generated and delivered to customers? Operations, think of us in that sense as the air traffic controllers of the power grid. So these electrons, they move at the speed of light. And so we are matching supply and demand in literal real time. We monitor the transmission system to make sure that we navigate those electrons to where they need to go, again, in literal real time. And then the last component of this is markets. We run the largest wholesale power markets in the world. We run multiple markets that all have very different functions, but ultimately also serve to support reliability to try and leverage competition to keep costs down for consumers. Let's go to the next slide. And so ultimately, our primary focus is reliability, but through the use of regionality and scale, we're able to save consumers money. That value that we've calculated is roughly $3.2 to $4 billion annually. If you're going to utilize a regional mechanism, if you're going to have this sort of larger machine that you can utilize so that every little pocket of the country doesn't have to sort of build out its own system, it should save consumers money. And at the end of the day, that is a very important concept to PJM interconnection. Go to the next slide. Okay, so the next few slides will be some reference slides, and then we'll start talking about reliability. So this is PJM's existing installed capacity. You'll see it is a mixture of combination of natural gas, coal, nuclear, and renewable resources. About 185,000 megawatt system. Let's go to the next slide. This is a snapshot of West Virginia's installed capacity. You've got primarily coal as the fuel that's utilized in West Virginia, some natural gas, some wind, hydro, and oil. Let's go to the next slide. This is a descriptor of one transition that we've already somewhat seen in the PJM footprint, and that is the transition generally from coal to natural gas through the bulk of the footprint. That obviously is not the case in West Virginia, but certainly in Pennsylvania, Ohio, some of our other states, we have seen coal use reduced and gas use increased to fuel generators in the system. And that's primarily because of the shale gas revolution and that shale gas that really came into the power mix in this early time period that is represented in this slide, and now has a pretty good share of the overall power mix at PJM interconnection. Let's go to the next slide. And what you'll see with this slide is that, primarily because of that coal to gas transition, you've seen a pretty intensive reduction in emissions across the PJM footprint. So, our combination of planning, markets, and operations help facilitate this transition. And what you'll see is that through that, we have been able to reduce a combination of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and NOx in a pretty substantial way. With, of course, there's always work to be done in this front, but again, just a visual here of really in many ways how far we've come with some of these emission reductions. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this concept of being in yet another energy transition. And this is a reality for PJM because of this slide, because most of the generation that is in our generation interconnection queue, and what the generation interconnection queue is, it's really the line that generators get into to connect to the system, is some combination of solar, wind, or a hybrid or battery resource. There is very little thermal, and that's nuclear, gas, and coal in our queue. And so, you'll hear me talk about this concept of thermal generators as we progress through this presentation. Just bear in mind that is nuclear, coal, and gas units. There's very little thermal in our queue. And so naturally, PJM would take some time and study this energy transition, which is what we're about to talk about. We've undertaken what are really characterized as 3 phases of studies to date. And if you go to the next slide, this is just another piece of reference for you. This is what's in our queue from the state of West Virginia. Again, a lot of solar, very equivalent to what we saw in the previous slide that has the overall PJM dynamic, although you do have some natural gas in the queue as well. But if you go to the next slide, like I said, knowing that this is what's in our queue, we have really spent some time trying to study the concept of reliability and what we are going to need in order to maintain system reliability as we progress through this energy transition. And so this is the first paper that we published. This paper was published a couple of years ago, actually, and it's called Reliability in PJM Today and Tomorrow. And the way I think about this paper is, we are a very sort of scientific based company. If you are going to study something, let's first define that thing. And so within this paper, if you go to the next slide, we describe, what is reliability to us? What does it mean to PJM interconnection? And here what you'll see is we've got these building blocks of reliability. Do you have adequate supply? Are you forecasting correctly in order to create the right demand? So, generally speaking, as we want to make sure that we are adhering to the most important principles of supply and demand. So do we have adequate supply? Are we forecasting correctly to correctly forecast demand? Do we have a robust transmission system, which we talked about? And are we performing to the best of our capability in the operations arena? Do we have reliable operations? So that effectively is, okay, let's talk about, it's great to talk about reliability, but what is it? And so we published a paper effectively from our perspective, describing what reliability is. Now let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the first paper that is released in a series of papers entitled Energy Transition in PJM. And this particular paper was titled Frameworks for Analysis. If we go to the next slide. What we did with this particular paper is we effectively took a few different scenarios and kept on injecting more and more renewables into the system. So we have a base case, a policy case, and an accelerated case. That nomenclature doesn't really mean anything other than, in doing that, we were then able to derive some conclusions for what we'll call, an initial set of findings or concerns around the transition. And if you go to the next slide, it's really for us that third item that we really flag. And that item is this concept that thermal generators provide essential reliability services, and an adequate supply will be needed until a substitute is deployed at scale. So let's pause and let's talk about that for a second. So thermal generators, those are, again, nuclear, coal, and gas units, and they provide essential reliability services. So you're going to say, okay, Asim Haq from PJM, what is essential reliability services? And my answer to you is it's really smart people, physics stuff that I am not smart enough to explain to you other than the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is an entity that effectively monitors the reliability of the entire system. They actually have defined this concept of essential reliability services to include physics concepts like flexibility, ramp, voltage control, and a series of other items that are, from an engineering perspective, necessary to maintain grid reliability. And so what we're saying with this conclusion is that when we've studied these increased scenarios of renewable penetration, that we are going to continue to need these thermal generators that provide these essential reliability services until there's a replacement technology that is deployable at scale. So not the thing that is in just sort of like the R&D think tank that can be deployed, onesie twosie, something that is really able to be deployed at scale, that is a proven technology that can replace these thermal generators because of the physical nature of renewable resources, which are intermittent in nature. And so we're trying to balance both, the infusion of these intermittent resources and also maintaining system reliability, and we'll need these essential reliability services to do so. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the paper that really prompted sort of my engagement with you all today. This is a paper that we released just a little while ago in February. And this paper highlights trends that we believe in combination present increasing reliability risks during the transition due to a potential timing mismatch between the combination of resource retirements, so those are resources leaving the system, a growth in demand, and then the pace of new generation entry. And so before I talk about the conclusions of this paper, I want to make something really, really clear. We introduced this paper in February, and what is still the case is that sort of the industry is entrenching itself to either support this paper or criticize the paper. At PJM, again, we simply are trying to provide our best analysis and try not to be sort of impacted by the external criticism or even support. We are just trying to provide what we see on the system. But I think it's important to note that from our lens, just based upon what's in the generation interconnection queue, the system is going to naturally get greener. And simultaneously, as the system gets greener, we will have different reliability concerns that we've had in the past, and we have to try and help the industry navigate those. All of this for the benefit of 65 million consumers in our footprint and maintaining reliable power delivery to those consumers. So, please keep this in mind as I download the conclusions of this paper to you. All we're trying to do, in settings like these is inform our policymakers of what we're seeing, and that we're going to try and lead to try and find fixes to these challenges. These are not meant to be sort of, policy pieces advanced on behalf of PJM interconnection, even though they may have a direct impact on how policymakers think about the issues that we're facing during the transition. Go to the next slide. So again, I said to you, there are some trends that when combined create, I think, a reliability risk that PJM is trying to get out in front of. And so this is the first trend. And this relates to the concept of load growth. A way to think of load is just demand. Okay, so, basic fundamentals of supply and demand. We think that demand is likely to continue to increase as we progress through the rest of this decade and into the next. This is primarily due to the couple concepts of electrification, as well as, especially in the PJM footprint, a proliferation of data centers. And these data centers are really, really intense consumers of power. And so as we forecast demand, remember, an important building block of reliability for us is being able to accurately forecast demand. As we see demand over the next really decade and a half, we see demand increasing primarily because of electrification and data center growth. So just keep that conclusion or keep that piece of the analysis in mind. Let's go to the next slide. So we talked about demand. Demand is going to increase. Will supply also increase to match demand? Well, that's our concern. So what we are seeing is that thermal generators are retiring at a pretty rapid pace due to a combination of government and private sector policies, as well as some economics. We don't want to say this is all about policy. In some instances, the economics of the plants don't lend themselves to being economical for consumers on a going forward basis. But we have forecasted that by the latter parts of this decade, we are going to see roughly 40 gigawatts of power. Again, we're a 185,000 megawatt system, roughly 40 gigawatts of power that represents about 21% of PJM's current installed capacity. We're going to see that leave the system. And so, again, fundamentals of supply and demand, demand's increasing, supply, at least on the thermal side, is decreasing. And then let's look at what we're seeing on the next slide. Let's look at what we are seeing as it relates to, okay, well, you've got all of these resources that are waiting in the queue. Can't these resources sort of supplement or make up for the watts that you're losing? And I think what we are finding here is that, the retirements that we are seeing, those 40 gigawatts of retirement, are at risk of outpacing the construction of new resources. This is a graphic that we put together that shows, a couple of different scenarios. One's a low entry scenario, that's the 15,000 megawatt number, it's a lower line, and then a high entry scenario for what we could potentially see by that same time frame that we're seeing resources drop out of the system. And we wanted to include two different scenarios to be fair. One that feels based upon historical completion, more potentially accurate picture of resources that we expect to come on. And we also wanted to include a scenario that we just derived from S&P Global, where we have what also could be the scenario of resources coming onto the system if we're able to see renewable resources come onto the system quicker. Effectively, the story to be told here is that we are seeing demand increase, we are seeing our thermal supply decrease, we are seeing our intermittent supply wanting to come onto the system, and they need to come onto the system at a pace that replaces those thermal resources coming off the system. Now, they're not one-for-one replacements. You'll see some bracketed numbers and then some numbers above the bracketed numbers. It's basically, think about it as a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every sort of megawatt of thermal we lose, we need 3 megawatts of renewable resource. And so, we are we're hopeful. The way I will characterize this is, we are expressing our concern today, but we are hopeful that we will get the resources that we need from purely enough supply to meet demand in order to deal with this issue. But currently, when we talk to renewable developers, we hear about issues related to supply chain, to siting, and other issues that are not fully known to us right now. But we need the pace of new resources entering the system to increase. We certainly play a part in that. And so we have had a pretty backlog generation interconnection queue for some time. We went through an exhaustive process to try and create a reform package that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission would approve. Our stakeholders overwhelmingly endorsed that package. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approved that package. We are in the throes of implementing that interconnection process reform, and we expect to study, a couple 100,000 megawatts of renewable projects, in a very short period of time here. So we think we will certainly study enough projects, and enough projects will get through our queue to sort of meet this sort of need for supply. But whether they come onto the system or not is something that is, somewhat out of our control after we have studied the project. And again, a concern that we feel like we need to raise across, our footprint with policymakers and our membership. This is nothing that our members and our states also have not seen. Let's go to the next slide. So really, I'd focus on that upper right. So this is the sort of rounding out the 4R paper discussion. Look at the upper right. Resource retirements and load growth could potentially outpace new entry. That's the lesson to be learned from the analysis that we just put together, that 4R report. We are really tackling, thinking about how we can lead to tackle this issue. And one of the first things that we're doing is, outside of course, reforming the generation interconnection queue that I just talked about, is some markets reform. And so there's that, and there's a series of activities PJM plans to advance within our stakeholder community, and eventually to be filed with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. To try and lead us through this problem solving. And the obviously the state of West Virginia and your commission in particular, which are very active. In these discussions will be, essential to trying to both be, really solid thinkers at the table, but also hopeful to, support fixes that will alleviate some of these reliability concerns. We're going to talk about one more reliability issue, and then I'm going to summarize it all in one slide, and we will get to questions and answers. So let's go to our next slide, please. I addressed the Senate Committee on Energy Industry and Mining after Winter Storm Elliott. I just wanted to talk through a few items related to Winter Storm Elliott and then sort of tie up all of our reliability concerns in a bow and tell you, we are trying to work on these things. And so the first item, the first slide here, Winter Storm Elliott took place between December 23rd and the 25th. Really record low temperatures and record drops in temperatures, 30 degrees below with wind chill in some areas of our footprint. Let's go to the next slide. And, over a 12-hour period, it's the largest drop in temperature that we've seen at PJM, roughly 29 degrees, which is, again, a 12-hour temp drop record in the PJM footprint. Let's go to the next slide. Demand was extraordinarily high and a true historic outlier during this period that we saw. If you look at sort of the x-axis below, you'll see, on that given date, that's a pretty incredible spike from what the average is. And then if you go to the next slide, the demand stayed unusually high overnight, which was pretty relevant for the challenges that we faced going into the 23rd and the 24th. Let's go to the next slide. Really, the primary story to be told from the PJM footprint's perspective is that we lost a significant portion of our generation fleet during Winter Storm Elliott. Just simply was unable to perform in the conditions that Winter Storm Elliott provided. And we didn't get great notification. If you look at that upper right-hand box, over 92% of all outages were reported to us with less than an hour's notice or with no notice at all. I, use this as an analogy. Our operators are in the control room. And if you haven't gotten the opportunity to come visit PJM and see the control room, we welcome you. It's really, a sight to be seen with these operators trying to match supply and demand in real time. But it's really, sort of an on the ground. Gives you an on-the-ground understanding of what these folks are doing. But effectively, these operators are trying to keep the grid reliable. They're trying to put together the pieces of a pretty intricate jigsaw puzzle. Every time they think they found a piece, someone calls or nobody calls, and that piece is not available to them. And that was, I felt like, within the entire sphere of our operators, our asset owners, our states, our consumers who met the call for conservation of power over those few days. It was not a comfortable time during the Christmas holidays to try and conserve power. Everyone collectively helped to keep the lights on. But this was a really challenging period for PJM, where we are continuing to analyze the facts, and we'll be releasing a report. If you go to the next slide, we'll be releasing a report that says mid-April. It's been pushed to the June-July timeframe, detailing some of the concerns that we saw out of Winter Storm Elliott, some of the issues, some of the causation elements around Winter Storm Elliott, and what we intend to do to try and solve some of the issues that we saw. Let's go to our final slide. So that was a lengthy presentation, sort of a primer on what PJM is, who we are, what we do, and we talked through sort of our primary reliability concerns as we sit here today. And we'll start with the one that we just finished. Okay, the most near-term reliability concern is this concept of, we need to support generator performance. Okay, so today we have enough resources. Today we have enough resources with those essential reliability services. Remember, those are those sort of physics-related properties of the grid that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation said you need in order to keep a grid reliable. We have enough resources, we have enough watts, and we have enough essential reliability services for the grid to be completely reliable. But our generators need to they need to perform, and PJM and all of the membership and all of its consumers need to help sort of support that performance. And so that is one task at hand, is really trying to, in the near term, make sure that even in the worst conditions that our generators perform. Then you've got sort of this midterm issue, which is the 4R report that we just described. Demand is going up. We are losing a lot of supply. Are we going to get an injection of supply so that supply and demand meet? And so that is something that we are, again, keeping a very close eye on, but that's our midterm concern, having enough resources. We are advancing, some market reform efforts right now, and we have, a few items that are in the cooker to help try and alleviate that concern as well. Our longer term issue, and it's not a today issue, but it's upcoming, but so we need to be thoughtful about it. Again, is this essential reliability services. We have a very rich and diverse fuel supply of thermal generators with the combination of coal, gas, and nukes. And so we are going to need sort of some combination of those in the future. We have very little renewable penetration today. I mean, it's in the single digits as far as renewable penetration today. But as renewables continue to find their way onto the system, we're going to have enough in the right places on the grid of these thermal generators in order to continue to preserve reliability in the long run until a replacement technology is deployable at scale. And that could be something that's incented by the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act, or just a private developer, private equity saying, hey, there's a real opportunity on the grid to participate in markets and make money if we are able to find the solution to this financial or to this reliability issue. We will financially gain. That's certainly a possibility as well. So we've got the immediate concern. We've got this sort of near-term, reliability issue, and we've got an upcoming concern, or near-term, mid-term, long-term, however you want to characterize it. And PJM is effectively trying to find solutions for all of these things, with our members, with our states as we sit here today. So thank you for the opportunity to present, totally unfettered there. And I hope that wasn't too much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Now, does anyone want to? Delegate Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that report, Mr. Huff. We really appreciate it. My first questions are about Winter Storm Elliott. Was my understanding that of those outages, it was 63% gas, 28% coal, and less than 1% of renewables. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. And Winter Storm Elliott is not part of this report that you put out in February. Is that right?
Winter Storm Elliott is effectively, hey, we're not in a, let's just say we're not even in a transition right now. We've got enough resources, we've got enough essential reliability services, we've got a really robust reserve margin. Why did the system not perform? And so that's really to us, it's all part of the same kind of reliability dynamic, which is sort of represented on this slide. But Winter Storm Elliott is a bit of a different animal than the sort of transitionary papers that we have advanced.
It seems like you're estimating about 47 gigawatts coming off of your grid. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the number was roughly 40 gigawatts by 2030.
So that's the next decade or this current decade. It seems like that's about comparable to the last decade. Would you agree with that?
I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but certainly we had quite a bit of generation come off and quite a bit of new generation, primarily natural gas, find its way onto the system. Yes.
Okay, so I think it can look kind of alarming that we see all these gigawatts coming off, but this is somewhat comparable to what we've been dealing with in the past in terms of just the volume of gigawatts coming off of the market.
I mean, we have already overseen an energy transition, and that transition was from coal as the dominant fuel to gas becoming the dominant fuel within the PJM generation stack. And so we have overseen a transition, already. We are trying to carefully oversee another one right now.
In the report, all of the assumed retirements due to policy, it seems like a lot of those are, if there was a rule by the EPA, like the Good Neighbor rule, for instance, that if the plants would incur any costs, that we would assume that those would retire in the earliest date possible. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of flexibility there. Do you think that?
If you are a generating plant and you have, whether it's a state emission limitation or a federal emission corrective action to take, and it's going to cost you, effectively capital, you will analyze whether or not, you should, in fact, invest to make those adjustments to your plant. And so that's a phenomenon that we're seeing across the footprint. We have some laws in our footprint that, effectively say that, these particular types of plants have to be gone by X date. But some of them, we'll call them, they could be classified as more, they could be classified in some ways as policy or economic based retirements based upon, hey, this is something you're going to have to comply with down the road. Will you in fact make the investment coal plant in, X advanced scrubber or whatever it might be in order to continue to operate? And so I think that you see a combination of some of those different policies, and the economic impacts, as you described, could very well be that, a unit may just decide we're not going to make the investment if we're going to just get shut down, an X year down the road.
At the earliest date possible.
The units that have been sort of characterized for retirement in the report, but I think that assumption was certainly made with some of the units.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, with your understanding of West Virginia state policies, we don't have any policies that are part of this. Would you agree? We don't have any policies that are shutting down our thermal plants.
I agree.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Delegate Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask a little bit about the existing system that PJM has to ensure that there's a sufficient reserve margin. And so my understanding is that in addition to getting paid for the energy that's produced, there's also a capacity market where the generators bid in, say, 3 years in advance to the capacity market, and they'll get paid to have that capacity available. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then that's based on supply and demand in this, right? In the sense that they don't necessarily get paid the same amount. It has to do with how many megawatts are bid in and how many megawatts are needed, supply and demand.
Yeah, I think that's right. Effectively what we do is we conduct a load forecast, we sort of shape the demand curve, and we procure enough. This capacity market is a 3-year forward-looking market. And so the easiest way to think about this is, let's say we run a capacity auction in 2030. We're making sure that there will be enough resources in 3 years down the road, in the 2033 timeframe, that there will be enough resources in order to meet demand, with a built-in reserve margin as well.
And so that the previous delegate Young, asked about the wave of retirements that happened around 10 years ago. This system was in place during that wave of retirements, right? And price signals were sent to incentivize, say, potentially slower retirements or faster construction of replacements.
Yes, the system was in place. Yep.
And did it serve to meet the required reserve margin?
I'd have to just go back and review all the various results from the auction, but I do believe that the reserve margin was maintained throughout the previous transition. Yes.
And in recent years, isn't it true that there's a target reserve margin, but this auction has resulted in actually exceeding the reserve margin so that there's actually excess capacity that has won the auction?
Yeah, we've been pretty capacity rich over the past series of years. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? We already had a pretty robust nuclear fleet. You had a pretty robust coal fleet. And then when you have states that are, literally sitting on top of the Marcellus Utica shale, you are going to get investment in natural gas as well. So we've been pretty capacity rich over a period of time. I think definitely what we are seeing, though, and part of the message to relay to you is, I do think that PJM is looking out towards the future and does view, based upon primarily policy, but some economics, that sort of rich capacity reserve that we've had over a long period of time here now is going to be pretty significantly reduced.
I guess what I'm trying to reconcile is this auction that's in place 3 years ahead, the price that will be paid for capacity in the future is going to go up significantly if there's more plants contemplating retirement. And so that will send a price signal to either slow down those retirements or speed the entry of new generators into the market, as has happened in the past. And I guess my last question is, why don't you think that would work in the future? It's essentially a free market auction to send a price signal to the generators that make adjustments year by year in terms of their future plans.
Yeah, I think theoretically you are correct, but I think it requires some nuanced discussion about, where the collective of the states, primarily the states and some in the federal government, are headed on a going forward basis. So you can send a price signal to construct capacity. We need to get the markets right in order to do that. I totally agree with you. I also think that the likelihood of getting a new nuclear plant, a new coal plant constructed is very, very low. And then on the gas side, you have seen some states, reject effectively the build out of new natural gas. and you've got sort of a dynamic here where would you send a market signal for the construction of something that, effectively a state or federal government is saying, we're not interested in the build out of that particular unit. So the markets are somewhat, we're working on market reform right now, but the market reform needs to account for what is effectively this dynamic where the markets, as traditionally thought of as these, free markets, are now actually, sending their own signals that there are particular resources that that the states or the federal government don't want to see constructed. And so that presents a bit of a different dynamic and a different challenge than the marketplace that you're describing with the coal to gas switch, which was pretty much purely a open and free market, where sort of the next level of resource found its way onto the system. Now, let me just conclude with this. You are very correct in that what we hope to do is we hope to create a markets dynamic where we are combination of, maintaining the resources that we need to maintain in order to preserve reliability. Okay, being agnostic of fuel, you're maintaining the resources that you need to maintain in order to maintain reliability, but you're also trying to create the right incentives to bring on this, for instance, in number 3 here, this technology that can be deployable at scale. We want to create an opportunity and for private dollars to work on and deploy at scale resources that can take the place of thermal generators. The only issue is right now is, as we sit here today, I cannot identify that technology for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, the delegate from Kanawha County said that solar wind was only 1% of the failure during Storm Elliott. Correct?
Yes, the renewable facilities, generally speaking, performed up to where they were expected to perform. That's correct.
And out of what is it, about 144,000 megawatts that was consumed right at Christmas. And thank God it was Christmas, so you didn't have all these people out to work and wasn't consuming more energy. But during that time frame, how much of that 43,000 megawatts was renewable?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the sort of scale, right? So if you're just looking at the PJM footprint,
what was your expectation of renewable during that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, look, just generally speaking, we do not have a substantial amount of renewable, deployment in the footprint. We're talking about approximately 7% of our entire generation fleet is renewable.
So the 1% failure is really something that looks good on paper, but in reality, it really wasn't there.
I think it's important to look at the scale. I think you're making a good point. I think it's important to look at the scale. As we sit here today, our system is roughly 44% natural gas, 27% coal, about 14% nuclear, 5% oil, 7% renewable. Roughly, that is our, in rough numbers, that is the percentage of our system. And so it makes sense then that, based upon those numbers, you are going to see something somewhat correlated related to the outages. Now, that's not to say that the outages are acceptable. That's not to say that that's an acceptable level of outages that we want to see from our generators. But I think your point is, what's the scale of the PJM generation footprint? What's the comparison between all the different fuel types, and does that kind of correlate somewhat to the outages? And so I fully understand and appreciate that point.
And during that time frame, as the delegate corrected me earlier, the AEP sent out an email suggesting that people, cut back on their usage. And I think that come from PJM. My point is, what happens if you hit that point of a meltdown? What's your procedures? What steps do you have at that point?
Yeah, we have a series of procedures that consist of a combination of alerts, warnings, etc. But we hope to never have to get to the place that we were with Winter Storm Elliott. But
I hate to interrupt you, but you don't have a crystal ball.
No, that's correct.
So what if? What is your step? I want this committee and anyone listening to hear what your step is if you can't reach what you need.
Yeah, I would think.
And again, thank God it was Christmas. People was home and not at work.
Yeah, we would try and control the situation from the control room. One of the things that we might ask that happen is this call for conservation. If the call for conservation didn't work in reducing demand, we would then issue what is called a voltage reduction. So that's, a sort of lower quality stream of power that is going out to all of the consumers. If that didn't work, we would have to likely go into we'll call it controlled load shed event, where we would probably rotate the outages from pocket to pocket to pocket across the footprint, knowing that we would only have sort of X amount of watts to support, Y amount of demand in the footprint.
I sell electric motors for a living, so I understand the voltage issues. And in the motor world, low voltage is high amps, and high amps is high heat, and high heat is meltdown. So you're saying y'all reduce voltage, which basically at a household, your hot water heaters, low voltage could damage, your refrigerators could get damaged, your TVs, everything household items could get damaged on low voltage.
Yeah, I am not an expert in what happens when you reduce voltage, and you working in the space you work in, more than me in that regard. I know that we would try and do so in a pretty controlled manner, but regardless, I think your point is a good one, which is that when we run tight on supply and demand, like we did at Winter Storm Elliott, some of these concerning steps become a reality.
How many coal-fired power plants had failure in West Virginia during Storm Elliott?
I don't have those numbers exactly, and I know that there are some concerns around sort of market-sensitive data. I don't have those numbers exactly, but to the extent that I can provide them to the committee, I'm happy to provide them to the committee at a later date. But as we sit here today, I don't have those numbers.
When you do your final report, I would like to know, or the committee know, out of each failure, what the failures were and locations. I think that would be at least 4 in West Virginia. And one, two more things here is the feds requiring y'all to go more renewables.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Is the federal government requiring y'all to push more towards renewables?
I'd respond to that by saying, sort of our queue is our queue, right? And so, we are not being required to gravitate towards the renewable industry. Certainly, there are some tailwinds associated with the renewable industry, whether it's state support, federal support that are assisting these resources and developing out and finding their way into our queue. But no, we are not being required to advance towards a more renewable system. Again, We are, primarily science, engineering, economics firm. We deal with what's in our queue, but as we sit here today, primarily what's in our queue is our renewable resources.
So cloudy days, 10 inches of snow, no wind. So you're saying you still can depend on renewable?
I think we are going to need a good mixture of resources, and especially that's what that third conclusion provides. We are going to continue to need our thermal generators, until there is the replacement tech deployable at scale. And I know I sound like a broken record on this, and I hate to do that, but I don't think as we sit here today that we can say that we can operate the system based purely on renewable resources. We're going to need, in the foreseeable future, a combination of renewable resources and thermal generators. And thermal generators include nuclear resources too. So this is not a sort of condemnation of zero carbon resources. Our nuclear fleet's an important fleet to mention. They're zero carbon, and they are thermal generators that provide these reliability services.
Do you think that America in a whole should look across the other countries that has went green and now they're going back to a thermal generated electricity, that we possibly should look at something like that? Are we smarter than them?
Well, I know that what we are doing at PJM is, I would say at PJM, we are, in fact, if you look at all of the different ISOs and RTOs, our sort of brethren across North America, we have one of the actual lowest renewable penetration statistics in that dynamic. And so what does that mean? That means that we have had the opportunity to observe those sort of situations that are occurring internationally, those situations that are occurring domestically. There are certainly some ISOs and RTOs whose reserve margins, as we sit here today, are much tighter than PJM's. So your point's a good one in that we are spending a lot of time studying, both internationally and domestically, how grid operators are dealing with this issue. And no grid operator is sort of immune from trying to figure out how to operate the system reliably during this energy transition. Every grid operator in the world is dealing with this.
Your personal opinion, if the tax dollar subsidies quit going to renewable, could they stand on their own 2 feet?
I am distinctly paid not to have a personal opinion about such matters.
Now, our chairman of Energy and Senate couldn't be here today, so he sent me a few questions. What's the percent of coal goes up during a cold spell? So basically, how much more coal are you using during a cold spell? Because I think he says here on the average, it's 24% on the average day to day. But what about during cold spells? How much?
I'd have to look at those. Yeah, I'd have to look at those aggregate statistics. But look, at the end of the day, if you can store coal, you cannot store natural gas. Natural gas moves at a particular sort of rate through a pipeline system. And so what we found during Winter Storm Elliott, was we had some challenges on that pipeline system, including at the wellhead with some freeze-overs. And so to the extent that you have on-site fuel that you can utilize to generate power, that's always going to be extremely helpful in events like these that are cold weather oriented. So I'm not sure what the exact percentages are, but certainly if you've got fuel stored on site, that can be pretty helpful in these types of emergencies.
Mr. Hawk, I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Delegates to Tesla.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your kind attention. I have a question. I see all these retirements,
I don't see the replacement for them. Is the replacement reliable? And what about the increase in demand? I mean, we're going to drop, 40 gigawatts out of the system. That means you have to replace that and the incremental increase that you have because of increased demand. How do you plan to deal with that? And if it's not reliable replacement, what do you do?
Yes, these are very pivotal questions that we're trying to resolve today. And I think if you just back out 1,000 feet and look at this, the first thing to note, which is something that we've already noted, is we have pretty low percentage of renewables in the system today, and so there is certainly room for more renewable resources to find, more intermittent resources to find their way onto the system. Now, what we've got to be careful about as we progress through that dynamic is that we've got enough watts, that's that midterm reliability, and enough watts that provide these essential reliability services. Okay, so these are two things that we're going to be monitoring very closely. Having enough watts, that's really the 4R paper that I just presented. Like you said, increased demand, lots of resources leaving the system, not enough resources finding their way onto the system. We have to do, PJM and the stakeholders, we have to do everything in our power to try and expedite those resources finding their way onto the system. The challenge is not everything will be in the control of PJM, the states, the members, et cetera. When something like supply chain creates a problem for these resources finding their way onto the system, sort of nothing that we could do in our planning, markets, or operations sphere, nothing a state could do. State can assist in siting, certainly can assist in siting the facility, but, that's not going to help. If there's a global supply chain issue, which we hope will be alleviated. So, we need to do everything in our power to try and expedite resources finding their way on the system. Now, in the long term, as the balance of thermal resources comes down, as the balance of intermittent resources increase, we need to make sure that we've got the right sort of resource mix balance to that long-term reliability issue, make sure we have enough essential reliability services to operate the system reliably. Now, if there's, again, we create the right market dynamic, to the gentleman earlier, if we create the right markets dynamic to the combination of maintain what we need to maintain and also incent new technologies, it may be the case that we could get more of a reduction in thermal resources than, if I had a third hand, I'd say, an increase in something else that's deployable at scale. But right now, we don't know what that is, right? It could be hydrogen, could be, long duration battery storage, but we haven't seen that tech sort of deployable at scale. So the way I view this is we have some variables that are in our control. Those variables that are in our control, we are going to do everything in our power along with our members. And, my hope is we'll get support from the states, support from the West Virginia PSC to try and alleviate concerns with variables that we control. Something like supply chain, I can't control. Something like, what is the replacement tech down the road for thermal resources? I can't control that either, other than creating the right markets dynamic to get those folks support. So, this sort of, somewhat, we feel very fortunate in that we do have a very robust generation fleet, very robust reserve margin today. We're beginning from that point. Others are not beginning from that point. Others are beginning from a far worse sort of situation than where we are. But we're at this point right now. We just need to be cautious as we progress through this. And I think just downloading information to policymakers like yourselves so that your eyes wide open as we progress through this transition, and we are transitioning as we progress through this, I think is really important. So it's a long-winded answer, and my hope is that, you know, it's at least somewhat illustrative of kind of what's going on in our heads.
I really appreciate that, because I just, from my personal opinion is you should be extremely cautious. Because the supply chain and I mean, some of these systems are not even hooked up, but they act like they're part of the grid. Some are not even built. So before we start talking retirement and that type of thing, we have to make sure of the reliability, and we should err to the side of caution. My opinion, just you can take that for what it's worth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hawk. This committee room is going to have to be utilized in about eight minutes for another committee meeting. Possibly one more brief question, Senator.
Thank you. I want to take this conversation up to a high level, political level. One of the things that bothers me is the American public has been sold a bill of goods on the urgency to go to all renewable. Nobody's allowed to ask, what does that cost? So my question would be, is it possible to go back to, say, 2010, when renewables were 7 times more expensive than heat driven, and say, okay, 1% of our electric came from 7 times as high, so your cost of your electric bill is 7% higher than it would have been if it was all fossil fuels, for example. And now, instead of 7 times higher, renewables are more like 4 to 5 times higher, but the percentage has gotten higher. So I'd like to see a chart of some kind, historical, of the cost of renewables, including subsidies, because if the taxpayers are paying, it's no different than if a user is paying it, and compare those two numbers. And now if you're at like 7% is renewable, but it's 4 times higher, your bill is 40% higher, for example. So if we had a metric that we could show the public that shows them graphically what it's costing you to do that, to go to all renewables, and it could be extrapolated even into the future in this decision making. If everybody understood, to me in the business now, everything's cost versus benefit, but the cost has left the whole conversation. I'm trying to find a way to make a metric that would demonstrate what the actual cost if you stay fossil fuels versus increase renewable. And that's just a question, can it be done? If so, I'd like to see it.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll look, maybe Lori and I will sort of scour a little bit and look for any analyses that that we might find. You know, cost, especially as it relates to this world, is, you know, it's challenging. There's of course going to be wholesale market costs, right? There's the costs that, you know, come out of the PJM market, right? And then there are the costs associated with the support of those, like kind of the out of market support of those resources. Then there are, you know, if I was putting my, you know, we have a number of members, including environmental advocates. If I was putting my environmental advocate hat on, they would say, well, there's costs of doing nothing, right? And those are sort of health, public welfare type of costs. And then there are costs of, you know, keeping units around beyond potentially their useful life. And so these different items are sort of extremely hard to kind of couch against each other. But your point's a good one, which is, you know, what's going to be the least cost
Opportunity. Keep it simple and valid.
Thank you very much for that. We'll look.
Well,
Senator Swope.
SWOPE.
Thank you, Senator Swope.
Okay, they need the room for another meeting. Vice Chair.
Mr. Chairman, move the committee adjourned.
Motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify so by saying aye. Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.